Welcome to the Natural Capital Podcast, produced as part of the Farm Advisory Service in association with the Scottish Government. My name's Harry Fisher, the host of the podcast, and over the course of the season, we are exploring topics related to Scottish natural capital, including what this means, its value to society and farmland, and the pressures and opportunities currently facing it. To do this, we speak to a wide range of people currently working and operating in this space, from farmers putting in the work on the ground, scientific institutes looking to put research into practice, and government and industry putting funding into action that can take place. Today's episode is on the history of Scotland's environment. To walk us through a history of Scotland's land use change and how looking to the past can help us make decisions in the future, we are joined by environmental historian Dr Ian Maclellan, who has recently completed the doctoral research at Strathclyde University. Hi Ian, how are you getting on?
Hi, I'm very well, thank you, Harry.
Good stuff. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast today. I'm really excited for this episode. I think it's going to be quite an interesting one to kind of roll back the clock and just kind of walk us through to where we are today, the problems we face, and kind of any lessons we can learn from history. But before we do that, I think we'll just kick us off with some introductions. So who are you, what do you do, and why do you do it?
As you say, my name's Ian. I've just recently completed a doctorate in environmental history at the University of Strathclyde. My particular area of research was in the management of hunting and fishing in the Southern Highlands from about 1550 to 1750, so it's quite specific. But in engaging with that research, obviously, you engage with a much wider range of topics, and I picked up quite a lot along the way, I would say. And the reason I got into that actually was because of my dad. My dad grew up in rural Argyll, and like a lot of men of his generation, seemed to spend quite a lot of his time fishing, whether he had permission or not. And I was kind of fascinated that there didn't seem to be a lot of research into something that's so important to Scotland and to Scottish culture as hunting, fishing, engaging with wild animals. So that was how I started the journey of doing my research, and then first through the University of Stirling, where I did a master's, and then through the University of Strathclyde, I kind of narrowed down my focus to basically Breadalbane, that area of the Southern Highlands, and just found it absolutely fascinating, absolutely deep dive into all of that, which I'm just coming up for air from now.
Yeah. I suppose it's one of those, the more you start looking into it, maybe the more you realise you don't know, and it's kind of peeling back the layers.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people would say that the more you research, you answer one question, but you generate 5 or 6 more. And
Yeah,
that just keeps going. That's what keeps you going.
absolutely. And I think that's kind of where this episode came from, or the kind of idea of this episode. We were chatting a bit before we kind of started recording, just about, when we talk about biodiversity and nature restoration, we're often looking to wind the clock back to restore, what once was. But I think it's important to know that, or understand that, where we are now is a consequence of, thousands of years of human settlement in Scotland, and the biodiversity that we have now is essentially what we are left with. It's and what is kind of evolved around us as we've settled here. So that kind of leads us into the kind of next question, which I understand is maybe quite a broad period of history, but could you maybe just give us a high level walkthrough of how Scotland got to this point?
Right, it's quite a difficult question to answer, and if you ask 3 academics, you'll get 5 different answers, kind of thing. But I think, in general terms, most people would agree, obviously, that people started inhabiting Scotland at the end of the last ice age. Initially as Mesolithic, so Middle Stone Age hunter-gatherers, and then later as Stone Age farmers. You then move into, I guess, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. So still in what we would term prehistory, we don't have any written records from those times. But by the time we get to the Romans arriving in Britain and getting as far north as, well, they got as far north as, at least as far as Perth, if not further north, there seems to be a bit of a myth that the Romans found a completely wild environment that was just a massive forest. And a lot of archaeologists and classicists are now questioning that idea, that actually, certainly in lowland Scotland, they probably found a farmed landscape. So there was, by the time the Romans arrive, the tree cover in Scotland was nowhere near as extensive as popular Hollywood films would make you believe. And that's because, for a number of reasons, there's been human intervention in the environment since the Stone Age, but there's also been climatic changes. So probably about 2,000 or 3,000 BC was maybe when woodland cover in Scotland was at its most extensive. And a combination of changes in the climate, a wetter, colder climate means it's harder for trees to regenerate. So where humans do clear trees, the woodland maybe doesn't come back or doesn't come back as strong. There would have been clearance of woodland to create arable farming, for example. Depending on what beasts are being grazed, they can also have quite a significant impact on tree regrowth. So all those processes are going on before we even get to the point of written history. And one way of kind of thinking about that would be if we think about the Antonine Wall that runs through the Central Belt. So the Antonine Wall was often regarded as that's the frontier of the Roman Empire. That's like there were legionaries on that defending the empire from the Picts. Some historians like David Breeze have actually argued that it was probably more of an administrative boundary. Maybe they were collecting taxes from people who were bringing goods into the empire, but it wasn't a solid boundary. It wasn't kind of wild beyond and civilized to the south kind of thing. And a lot of work that environmental historians are doing is around kind of rethinking those ideas that we have, these ideas that we've picked up from popular literature. I think the Romantic periods of the late 18th and the early 19th century has a lot to answer for in terms of the way we romanticize these supposedly wild or better times in the past. So that kind of gets us to the Romans. Obviously, Scotland has a very complex history in terms of the cultures and the languages that people are speaking. You've got the interaction with the Norse. One of the big impacts of contact with Norse culture was an improvement in seafaring, and actually that affects the ability of communities to get resource from the sea. So with better boats and better knowledge of the sea, you can venture further out, you can fish for deeper water species. All those kind of things are influencing how people feed themselves, which of course has a knock-on effect of what you're doing on the land. By the time, if you kind of fast forward to maybe a period that I'm more familiar with, by the kind of late medieval periods of 15th, 16th century, a lot of the land is managed either in multiple tenant farms or hierarchical tenant farms, but it's based around firm-tunes. So you'd have a collection of houses and families that are operating the run rig system or something similar to run rig with infield and outfield and using rough pasture in the summer. Everybody's really familiar with the idea of the shealing and summer grazing. And that's all based around a kind of mixed economy farming. So you're not producing cash crops. You're producing whatever you can as efficiently as you can to feed yourself and to pay your rent, which was usually paid in kind. So you'd pay in grain or cheese or meat to your landlord. And then and this is where things are connected to wider developments, like political developments. So a key change for Scotland was when the Union of the Crowns happened in 1603. So James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, and the Scottish aristocracy are having to compete on a much bigger stage with a much wealthier neighbour in terms of how they display their power and their wealth. And there's an argument that that drives them to be much more financially minded, because at that time, certainly in the Highlands, society tended to measure your power and your wealth, if you put it that way, by how many people you supported, how many people followed you. So people would tend to look at the density of the population in your land. How many people could you call out for a hunt, or how many people could you call on in time of war? That was kind of a measure of your power. And through the 17th and into the 18th century, a lot of your listeners will probably be familiar with the idea that farming becomes much more commercialised. And those that own large tracts of lands, essentially the aristocracy, lords, are starting to look at their land differently. So they're starting to look at it in terms of what's the financial benefit, what's the most efficient way for me to make money out of this land, which leads us into, I guess we would say, maybe the first phase of what's generally called the clearances. And this, I think, and I don't for a minute want to diminish the brutality of some of the clearance experiences that people went through at all. But I think in terms of a historical view, we need to see that as part of a process that was going on all over Europe, where things like Enlightenment ideas, the idea that you could somehow be scientific in the way that you managed your land, meant that there was landowners were trying to apply these kind of ideas to the way they managed the land. And there was a lot of interest in what was termed improvement with a capital I. So the idea that you would introduce new crops, or you'd actively manage woodland for timber cropping, or you'd rearrange the enclosures of your farms and the structure of the tenancies that people had, so that effectively it was more efficient for you as the landowner. And of course, in a lot of cases, that had quite negative impacts on the people who had been working the land. So you get people moving into crofting communities and then working in rural industries. And then you've got the second phase of clearance, where those industries are unable to support the population, and crofts are arguably overcrowded, and you've got that kind of second phase of clearance of what's euphemistically termed assisted passage. Like, we'll get you on a boat to the Americas just to get you off the land and remove that problem. So those are kind of, I guess, big, broad brush ideas about what's happening across the piece from the start of recorded history until maybe the 18th, 19th century. Would that do us to be going on with?
No, I think that's fantastic. Yeah, that's so interesting to hear you kind of walk through those big milestones of what changes, kind of where people are, and what the land looks like. And you were saying there, this kind of move away from farming being something to support yourself and potentially the people around you and cover rent, to the kind of economic pressures. Would you say that was the biggest driver of almost a kind of change in what the landscape looked like? This idea that you need to get the biggest kind of value out of the land that you own, or was it more of a status thing?
I think the two go hand in hand. So I think if you think about, for example, sheep ranching, introducing large flocks of sheep to upland, was clearly, that wasn't a subsistence farming strategy. That was about maximising your profit from wool. And in a lot of cases, it didn't work as well as people expected it to work. So they're then thinking about other ways that they can use the land. So you then have the rise of the sporting estate, and managing the land for effectively for the leisure of the upper classes. So you're managing quite extensive areas of land purely for grouse and deer. And that obviously has an impact on the plant cover in those areas. We know that a high deer population is very problematic for woodland regrowth, for example, despite the fact that deer are actually woodland animals. I think in terms of what we see today and the way we understand the land today, that transition into more commercialised farming and more commercialised exploitation of the land is probably the biggest impact that we can see if we're moving around Scotland now.
Yeah, we were kind of talking about that a bit about that as well. The kind of the change of, or this idea that human settlement would be bad for wilderness, and the idea that a wild landscape is one without humans isn't necessarily true at all, and quite often it's the opposite, and certainly from what you're saying and the kind of the history of these large kind of estates, you know they weren't managed in a way where diversity was kind of put at the forefront, if anything, the opposite, because it made it easier to tend to.
Yes, no, absolutely. And there's evidence from as early as the 1700s of really extensive raptor persecution by people who are interested in maintaining their game bird population, for example. And we know that if you take apex predators out of an ecosystem, it has lots of knock-on effects throughout that ecosystem. Yeah, I think that management for leisure is something that certainly interests me a lot. You were saying about humans in the landscape. I think when we talk about rewilding or wilderness, we need to remember that basically since the ice sheets retreated, human beings have been part of the landscape. We're not a recent addition. So we've been around as long as most of the species that we can see in our landscape now, certainly most of the mammal species. That's not to say that human presence in the environment is always positive. So obviously over millennia, we've seen reindeer became extinct in Scotland, and then followed by other big mammals like the bear and wild boar, the lynx, and then I guess the last big extinction of a land mammal would have been the wolf in Scotland. So those are clearly very evident human impacts. I think most environmental historians would agree that the main driver for those extinctions was human persecution or human overexploitation. But in terms of human impact on the environment that can be positive, an interesting thing to think about would be our woodlands. So again, we tend to have a popular idea that we were talking about this before we started recording, about the idea of the Great Wood of Caledon, this enormous forest that covered most of Scotland. And at some point in prehistory, a lot of Scotland was very densely wooded. Maybe about half or more than half the land would have been wooded. But remnant forests, so forests that we regard as wild now, nearly all have evidence of human interaction that's actually maintained the forests. So where a renewable resource is useful to humans, there's an incentive to maintain it. So an example might be there's a fantastic iron foundry at Tainault in Argyll
Mm-hmm.
that was established in the 18th century. And our natural assumption would be if you're making an iron foundry in the middle of a heavily wooded area, you're going to cut all the trees down and burn them. That's what you're going to do because you need the fuel. But people who've researched the impact of the iron foundry on that area of Argyll have suggested that actually what happened was quite large tracts of woodland were bought up and managed on a rotating coppice basis. So they'd coppice the trees to create charcoal for the iron foundry, but they do that on a rotational basis. And there is an argument, quite a convincing argument, that that activity actually prevented the woods from being clear felled because they were economically useful. So the incentive to just get rid of the trees and turn that land over to pasture or to building or to arable farming was less intense because the woods themselves were useful. And a lot of environmental historians talk about semi-natural woodland in Scotland. So there's very little woodland that hasn't been managed at some point by human beings.
Mhm.
So that impact can be more positive.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm reading a book at the moment about coppice woodlands, and it kind of goes into a bit about the history of them, and it's a whole world that I didn't, it's kind of a lost art in a lot of ways, but it was a way of woodland management that, and an argument that, like you say, it prevents kind of woodlands being clear felled and removed, but also adds a kind of structural diversity into woodlands that often boosts the biodiversity or the number of kind of bird species in them quite substantially. And it's something that's missing from a lot of our woodlands is this kind of shrubby underneath layer. Like you say, a lot of this will be down to kind of overgrazing from deer, but this kind of old woodland management system compared to how an idea of that if you just left a wood now that it would have better biodiversity than one actively managed by humans isn't necessarily true at all. It was just interesting you saying that about the kind of rotational management of the woodlands.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I don't think for a minute that the managers of it was actually called Bonaw Iron Furnace, which is confusing because Bonaw's on the other side of
Mhm,
the water from Tainal. But I'm sure the managers of Bonaw were not actively setting out to create better biodiversity. They just wanted a ready supply of charcoal for their
mhm,
furnaces. But absolutely, that cyclical renewal, cutting down trees, but cutting them down in a way that they can regrow means you've got a lot of new shoots growing. You're creating a gaps in the canopy for other plants to flourish for a while. It it's quite easy to see how that can quite easily generate a more diverse environment than a wood that's left to its own devices.
mhm. And I think the same could be said for the hedgerow, a habitat that we so there's a lot of push for it, and quite right, that they're absolutely alive with life whenever you see them, and there's a lot of benefits for kind of farmland, but these are another totally man-made habitat, and one that was brought in. Like you say, when it was the kind of enclosure period, we had author John Wright in at the kind of start of the season, and he was telling us all about the kind of the history of hedgerows down in Devon, which was interesting. But again, these are one that they're one of the kind of last lifelines of wildlife and biodiversity running through our countryside. But again, that wasn't what they were created for initially. These were ways to segregate the land.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think hedgerows are a really good example of a very practical solution to a particular issue. But the unintended consequence of that is you're then creating a little haven, especially for small birds and small mammals, in an environment that might otherwise be quite difficult for them.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I want to kind of circle back to your kind of area of research is in game management.
Mm.
Would you be able to talk a bit about that and a little bit about how it both land managers, but just how the average Joe would go about accessing kind of wild game and its importance to. I mean, when you told me that, I just immediately started thinking of Danny Champion of the World, and
Yeah,
that's what kind of sprung to my mind. But
yeah,
would you be able to tell us a bit about the relationship there?
sure. So I think a good starting point would be to say I think when we talk about game management, we need to be really clear that primarily hunting wasn't primarily a way of providing food to a community. It was about the amusement or the leisure of the people who were doing the hunting, as far as elite hunting was concerned. In Scotland until about 1700, certainly in the Highlands, and there's evidence that this was also the practice in the borders, the most prestigious form of hunting was deer drives. So you'd get the whole community together, you'd identify a herd of deer, and you'd drive the deer towards waiting hunters. And there is evidence. So, for example, on I think it's on Rum, there is still an elric, which is a kind of stone barrier that was used to corral the deer so that they could be more easily killed. But that practice of hunting was really, really important culturally. So it was a way for a landowner to demonstrate how much resource he could deploy for a leisure activity. And some of the hunts went on for days. You know, they were really, really big operations involving dozens or hundreds of dogs, hundreds of people, both in terms of the drivers or the beaters, but also the hunters. And it was a way of demonstrating a bit of community cohesion and organisation. And it was also one of the things that I've argued in my research is that it was a way of signalling to your neighbours and your rivals what your power was like. You know, it was a very much a conspicuous display. And to support that hunting, there were lots of deer forests in Scotland in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. So generally areas of upland that were designated as forest, they would usually have some tree cover, but they wouldn't be extensively wooded necessarily. But the important thing was that forest law applied, and a constant friction in those upland areas was between local communities who wanted to use the uplands for grazing in the summer and gamekeepers or the owner of the forest who wanted to preserve the deer in the forest. So you see kind of, I guess, negotiated settlements there where a certain amount of grazing is permitted. Often there'd be one area of the forest that everybody agreed we won't graze our animals there because that's the best part of the forest for the deer. So they have a kind of sanctuary. But it then also becomes a source of conflict from between landowners. So in my research, I looked at a very extended dispute over the Forest of Mamlorn, which sits between I need to get this right, between Glenlochy and Glenlyon in Perthshire. And basically, a new landowner in Glenlyon was encouraging his tenants to go and graze their cattle in the forest. And the Earl of Breadalbane, who was the king's forester for the forest, took exception to this. And there was a very long, extended dispute that ended up going to the House of Lords over who had what rights in the forest, who owned, whether the person who was the forester actually owned the land. And like many legal disputes at the time, it kind of ended in a compromise solution where the Earl of Breadalbane had to let the Glenlyon tenants have a certain amount of grazing in the forest, but because it was so meticulously prepared for court, it created lots and lots of evidence for us. So lots of concern about people who were going to the summer grazings and maybe were poaching deer on the side. A lot of evidence also, though, of cooperation between the gamekeepers and the people who were managing the grazing animals. But sorry, the reason I went into that in so much detail is that there was a sense from the Middle Ages onwards that hunting was something that the elite did. And it was mainly concerned with deer and wildfowl. Deer and wildfowl were reserved to the elite. And really, your average Joe shouldn't be hunting either deer of any species or wildfowl, especially not red grouse or black grouse. The fact that tenant farmers, cotters, did poach against the Lord's wishes is quite evident. I've looked at a lot of court records from Breadalbane that would indicate that a lot of tenant farmers would engage in a fly bit of poaching from time to time. And some people were maybe semi-professional poachers as well. So there's, I guess there's been a source of rural conflict for a long time over that, whether that was deer or wildfowl or salmon. Actually,
Mhm.
salmon were also included in that kind of mix.
That's so interesting. Yeah, not something maybe I've thought about too much before, but that kind of conflict between, who owns the land and who has right to use it. How do you kind of see how things have evolved to where we are now with regard to kind of a lot of the Scottish uplands, and you know community access to these, and the future of their management?
I might respond to that by taking the conversation in a kind of sideways slant slightly. I think one of the really interesting developments in environmental history that was led by the former historiographer royal Christopher Smout, who really kicked off the business of environmental history in Scotland. He wrote quite extensively about the idea of how we think about the land. So he talked a lot about landscapes of use and landscapes of delight. So that the difference between a landscape that's used for food resource or mineral resources and a landscape that's used primarily for leisure, and where the two overlap. And I think one of the challenges for us moving forward is, given that so many of the people who live in Scotland live in urban environments, myself included, we maybe have a different understanding of the rural environment. And that's influenced very heavily by ideas we were talking about before we started recording, about the kind of romantic idea of wild landscapes and wilderness, and it's pristine. So when you think of shortbread tin Scotland, you think of rugged mountains and glens and a stag standing on a rock kind of thing. And I think that image is quite deeply imprinted in a lot of people's minds as to that's how Scotland should look. And I think that makes the conversation around how we actually manage the land quite difficult. Um, I think there's a challenge around our deer numbers and how we manage deer populations. I think that is is a challenge, and it's very hard to see how anybody could get it right and keep everybody happy. I think is one thing. Um, Again, kind of referencing my own work in hunting, I think recognizing that there's maybe different ways of managing the land that can still sustain a kind of supporting sporting activity without, maybe moving away from driven grouse shooting and the kind of model of deer stalking that we have at the moment to something a bit different, something a bit more like the kind of Scandinavian model, where I'm not a hunter, so I can't really comment, but it seems maybe a bit more challenging. You're hunting in you're hunting in a more wooded environment. It's maybe a bit more adventurous. That's not to say that a day out on the hill deer stalking isn't physically demanding, but I think I think there's so much demand for the leisure use of a rural space that we need to find a way to accommodate that, and economic activities like farming. There needs to be a kind of balance there. And one of the things that I think is sometimes quite difficult is that, especially with sort of social media debates, everything gets polarized really quickly. And that you kind of get a sense that actually, if we could all just have like a well intentioned conversation about this, we might get somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't always need to be one thing or the other. It's almost always in the middle. We kind of spoke a little bit about, you know, a lot of the measures for biodiversity are a case of looking back in time, and rewilding and restoring is very much bringing back what once before. From a kind of historian's point of view, how do you view land restoration going forward in Scotland? Is there any lessons we should learn from history? Um, and what's your opinion on that?
I think I would start by saying there's a simple solution to every problem, and the simple solution is invariably wrong. But I think it would be more useful to think about managing the land for diversity rather than having some sort of idea that there was a golden age that we're trying to get back to. I don't think there was a golden age, but even if there was, how could we ever go back to it? Whereas I think prioritizing biodiversity in land management is probably a more useful way to think about it. And I think on both sides of the debate, so I quite often follow rewilding debates, which tend to set up, especially sporting estates and rewilders, in head-to-head conflict. And both sides of the debate appeal to history. So sporting estates will say, "But we've managed the estate like this for hundreds of years." I'd argue maybe not as long as they say they've managed the estate like that. And on the rewilding side, there's a kind of general appeal to a time in the past when there was more tree cover and there was more biodiversity. And actually, I think it might sound a bit odd for a historian to say this, but actually recognizing that the conversation we need to have now is what we're doing tomorrow, not what we did yesterday. Um, and I think recognizing that humans have been involved in the landscape of Scotland, like we say, since the ice caps retreated. Sometimes that's been positive, sometimes it's been negative. So, where can we see positive land management examples where we do maintain or increase biodiversity, but we don't do it in a way where we recognise that that might be quite hands-on. So, for example, managing woodland so it's as diverse as possible. I think there's a debate to be had about the reintroduction of previously extinct species. I know beavers have been making quite a significant comeback, but I think there's often a danger that each of these issues is taken in isolation. So you if you advocate, for example, the reintroduction of the lynx, um, that discussion needs to take account of what else is going on in terms of land management, what else is going on in terms of how we fence areas, how we manage flocks of sheep, how much of a risk the lynx actually pose to livestock versus to roe deer, for example. But I think a more nuanced conversation around that. And I think that the key thing for me would be thinking in terms of managing for biodiversity rather than either clinging on to what we have just now or trying to create a wilderness. Those seem to be the things that are in opposition, and maybe the way forward is to think, well, actually, let's talk about how we manage things to increase biodiversity. And that could look very different in different areas.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point. And I like the way you worded it there. A lot of these maybe kind of conflicting views are both looking to at times wind the clock back just to different periods. But I
Yes.
think you're right enough in thinking that the push for biodiversity is that in diversity there is strength, there's resilience, and we don't want to become too reliant on too little. And so looking back can give us a sense of what used to work, and we can use that. But um, yeah, that this kind of looking at landscapes and almost romanticizing them, like you said, which has been
Yes,
done throughout history. There's a danger in that, but it's I think it's important, and I think that's what I've enjoyed about this podcast is you know in understanding your history, you can understand how we got to where we are, and where a lot of ideas have came from regarding the way we manage our land. And there's no harm in looking back, but you know, like you say, it's impossible to roll the clock back. But that doesn't mean you can't look back and say, well, what used to work and what tools from before can we use in the future to, like you say, increase the diversity of life to give us more resilience in the future.
absolutely. And what's also had unintended negative consequences in the past, you know,
Mhm.
um, where we've maybe not thought through what's introducing thousands of sheep to an upland landscape going to do to that landscape. Um, that's not to say that we wouldn't do it again necessarily, but at least you're making an informed decision about what's the likely outcomes of this,
Mhm.
and are there ways we can mitigate some of the negative effects. So I think you're absolutely right. I don't think we can turn the clock back, but I think we can understand that complex relationship that humans have with the environment in Scotland has always been there, and there's always been um, negative and positive outcomes of that. Um, the other thing I just wanted briefly to mention that we haven't really covered at all is climate. So obviously, climate change is a very, very, very urgent and pressing concern for us today. I think it is worth reflecting that one of the things that comes out of environmental history research is that changes in the climate have always had quite a significant impact, especially on a place like Scotland, where certainly in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, there was a lot of farming was quite marginal. It was subsistence or just above subsistence level. And there was a period of maybe about 400 years where average temperatures were lower, the so-called Little Ice Age. And within that period from about 1450 to about 1850, within those 4 centuries, there were periods when there were particularly bad winters, particularly more frequent extreme weather events that had a significant impact. There was recurrent famine in the 1690s in Scotland because the weather was so bad and crops were failing. Um, we've obviously got the opposite challenge now of temperatures increasing, but the impact of extreme weather events like an increased number of storms, floods, those kind of things there's parallels to see there that actually underlying all the human activity and the changes in what we understand in our culture and our religion and our politics, you've also got macro level things that are going on, like big changes to the climate, and that needs to be part of our thinking.
Mhm. No, no, that's an excellent point. And probably quite a nice one to kind of tie things up on. I think just to again tie in one of the other big problems and kind of issues facing kind of farming and society today. Um, Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, Ian. I don't know if there's any other final points you would like to make, any of your work in the future or groups you're a part of that you'd like to mention if anybody wants to get involved.
I would recommend there's an excellent book by Chris Smout called Nature Contested. It's a collection of essays about environmental history in northern Britain. You can get it on Amazon. It's quite widely available. So Nature Contested by Chris Smout is a really good starting point for anybody who's interested in these topics. Um, I'd also plug the work of the University of Stirling in environmental history. They've done a lot of great work in that area, especially on things like rural industry, the impact of lead mining, on rural environments. There's a series of books that have just been published. They're not cheap, but they're very impressive, by Professor Richard Oram. It's a 3-volume environmental history of Scotland. If you can, so the first in the series is called A Land Won from Waste, and the second is Where Men No More May Reap and Sow. It's about the Little Ice Age. I'd recommend them for someone who wants to do a deeper dive. And finally, just to say, I am one of the directors of a small social enterprise startup called Ichnos Heritage. I'll send you a link. We are very interested in engaging with communities and supporting communities in understanding their own heritage and celebrating their heritage. So if people want to check out our website or get in touch, I'd be very pleased. And just to say thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
No, thank you very much, and we'll be sure to put all those things you mentioned in the show notes. So if anybody wants to go check them out, there'll be a link in there. But no, thank you, Ian. That was a really interesting episode and about a really important issue that I think gives context to everything that we face today. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Natural Capital. If you want to find out more on everything we have discussed, you can find links in our show notes, and more information is available on the Farm Advisory Service website. You can listen to all the previous episodes from the Natural Capital podcast and all the other series produced for Fast Sounds on any podcast provider or wherever you are listening to this one. You can access a wide variety of other resources on the Fast Sounds page on the Farm Advisory Service website. I've been your host, Harry Fisher. Producer is Ian Boyd. Executive producer Kerry Hammond and Kirsty Blackwood, and our editor is Kieran Sim. This Natural Capital podcast is produced for Fast Sounds as part of the Farm Advisory Service in association with the Scottish Government.
The Farm Advisory Service podcast. Audio advice on livestock, crops and soils, environment, rural business, and more. Brought to you in association with the Scottish Government.